The Galactic Council had ruled the stars for 12,000 years, and peace had become so normal that most species had forgotten what war even looked like. Inside the massive crystal halls of Council Station, representatives from 400 different alien races gathered to discuss trade agreements and settle minor disputes between neighboring worlds. The station floated in neutral space where no single species held power, and where ancient laws kept everyone safe. Among the oldest records buried deep in the Council archives were texts that almost nobody read anymore. These were prophecies left behind by the precursors, who were the first civilization to travel between stars. The precursors had vanished long ago, but their warnings remained and collected dust and forgotten. Databases Commander Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the human ship Endeavour and watched the stars shift as his vessel dropped out of faster-than-light travel. His crew of 38 humans had just completed a journey that took them further from Earth than any human had ever gone before. They were approaching Council space with a simple message of peace, broadcast on every frequency their communication system could produce. Jake was a calm man in his 40s with gray starting to show in his dark hair, and he carried the weight of representing all humanity on his shoulders. His second-in-command was Lieutenant Amy Peterson, who worked at the communication station trying to decode the responses coming from Council territory. Amy was young and brilliant with a gift for languages that made her perfect for this mission. On Council Station, Ambassador Velthar of the Corvani Empire received the human transmission with mild interest. The Corvani were tall, elegant beings with silver skin and 4 arms who had been founding members of the Council. Velthar had served as an ambassador for 60 years and had welcomed 17 new species into the galactic community. He expected humans to be like all the others, which meant they would be grateful for the chance to join civilization and eager to learn from their more advanced neighbors. The ambassador sent back a standard greeting package that included translation, protocols, and an invitation to meet at a border station. Amy worked for 3 straight days to make the translation software compatible with human brains because the system was designed for alien neural structures. When she finally got it working, the relief on the Endeavour was obvious. The Council was willing to talk, and that meant humanity might soon have a place among the stars. Captain Lisa Hayes, who commanded the Endeavour, kept her concerns to herself because something about the Council's tone bothered her. They sounded polite, but there was an undertone that reminded her of adults speaking to children. Dr. Helen Garcia was the chief scientist aboard the Endeavour, and she spent most of her time studying the data packets the Council had sent. She was particularly interested in brief mentions of the precursors, who apparently had seeded hundreds of worlds with life, before vanishing without explanation. The records suggested the precursors had left behind ruins on many planets along with warnings about something they called the Awakening. Helen found it strange that such an advanced civilization would just disappear, and she wondered what had scared them enough to leave prophecies behind. The first official meeting happened at a trading station on the edge of Council space. Commander Morrison led a team of 5 humans, including Amy and Helen, to meet with Council representatives. Ambassador Velthar greeted them with formal courtesy, along with delegates from the Gentari Collective and the Plenary Assembly. The Gentari were insect-like beings with compound eyes, while the Plenary were small and graceful with pale blue skin. The meeting room was designed to accommodate many different body types, and the humans felt distinctly out of place among beings who had been traveling the stars for thousands of years. Back on the Endeavour, Captain Hayes monitored everything from orbit. She had spent 20 years in Earth's space fleet and had developed strong instincts about when something was wrong. The Council representatives were being perfectly polite, but Hayes could see they didn't take humans seriously. To them, humanity was just another primitive species that had stumbled onto faster-than-light travel and needed guidance from their betters. Hayes knew that attitude could be dangerous because underestimating someone often led to mistakes. Velthar truly did see humans as primitives who needed help. Their technology was crude compared to Council standards, with weak shields and weapons that still used chemical propellants alongside early energy systems. Their understanding of advanced physics was basic at best. The ambassador had seen dozens of species just like this, and they all followed the same pattern once they joined the Council. They would adopt Council technology and Council ways, and within a few generations they would be just like everyone else. Velthar saw no reason why humans would be any different. During a break in the negotiations, Helen asked about the precursor texts because she had noticed references to something called the Awakening. Velthar dismissed her question with a wave of one of his four hands. The precursor prophecies were religious nonsense, he explained, and most scholars believed the precursors had destroyed themselves through war or disease. Their warnings were just the desperate hopes of a dying civilization and held no real meaning for the modern galaxy. Helen didn't argue, but she made a mental note to research the topic further when she got the chance. On Earth, President Daniel Cole stood before the United Assembly and announced that humanity had made contact with an alien civilization. The news spread across the planet within minutes, and celebrations broke out in every major city. After centuries of wondering if humans were alone in the universe, they had finally found others, and those others had invited humanity to join a galactic community. Plans were immediately drawn up for trade missions and cultural exchanges. The dream of walking among the stars alongside alien friends seemed within reach. Far away on a remote world called Krelvar, an old scholar named Korvan studied his instruments with growing alarm. Korvan belonged to a group called the Seekers, who dedicated their lives to studying precursor ruins and trying to understand their warnings. He had spent 3 centuries examining a precursor temple on Krelvar, and his instruments had just detected something impossible. The temple's power systems, which had been dead for thousands of years, were activating. The patterns matched ancient descriptions of the Awakening. Korvan immediately sent urgent messages to the council, warning them that the prophecies were coming true. His messages were received by automated systems that flagged them as religious spam and filed them away unread. The negotiations continued for 2 weeks, and preliminary agreements were reached. Humanity would be granted probationary membership in the council, with full membership to follow after 20 years. In exchange, humans would receive access to basic council technology and protection under council law. Commander Morrison felt proud of what his team had accomplished. Lieutenant Kevin Brooks, who served as tactical officer, spent his free time studying council military capabilities, and what he learned troubled him. The council had not fought a major war in over 4,000 years. Their military was designed for police work and fighting pirates, not for real combat. Brooks wondered what would happen if the galaxy ever faced a serious threat. Amy Peterson became friends with a young Plenary technician named Sheelar during the talks. Sheelar was fascinated by humans and asked endless questions about Earth culture. During one conversation, she mentioned the precursor prophecies which her grandmother had believed in. Sheelar called them the old fears, but said her grandmother had always insisted they would come true. Sheelar herself thought it was all superstition because the modern galaxy was far too advanced to worry about ancient warnings, as the Endeavor prepared to return to Earth. With news of success, something stirred in the unmapped regions beyond council space. On a dead world circling a dying star, ancient machines powered up for the first time in 10,000 years. The Scourge, which the precursors had warned about, had detected the activation of the temple on Krelvar. They began moving toward council space with one purpose built into their programming. They existed to eliminate all biological life, and they had been waiting for a signal to resume their mission. The countdown to war had begun, but nobody in the council knew it yet. 6 months had passed since first contact, and humanity had established a permanent embassy on Council Station. Ambassador Claire Donovan represented human interests in the galactic government, and she found the work both exciting and frustrating in equal measure. Claire was a skilled diplomat who had spent 30 years handling international relations on Earth, but the Council moved with painful slowness. Every decision required consensus from hundreds of species, and centuries of tradition governed every procedure. She understood why things worked this way, but sometimes she wanted to scream at the inefficiency. Human trade ships had started making regular runs to Council worlds carrying Earth art and culture along with products from Earth's diverse biosphere. Captain Ryan Foster commanded a cargo vessel called the Horizon, and he had quickly become popular among Plenary merchants. Ryan was an easygoing man in his 30s who had a gift for making friends wherever he went. He had made 3 successful trading runs and was planning his 4th when reports started coming in about ships disappearing on the frontier. On Krelvar, the old seeker named Korvan watched his instruments with increasing desperation. The precursor temple was now fully active and displaying what the ancient texts called the Doom Clock. Corvan had managed to translate enough of the display to understand they had less than 1 year before catastrophe arrived. He sent messages to the council every day begging them to pay attention, but every message was automatically filtered into spam folders. The council's systems had been programmed long ago to ignore religious content, and nobody had thought to update the filters. Dr. Helen Garcia had received permission to study precursor sites, and she had set up a research station on an abandoned world called Theta 7. Her team of 12 human scientists worked alongside council researchers to decode precursor writing. What they found was deeply disturbing, because the texts were not religious prophecies but technical warnings. The precursors had created something called the Scourge, which was an automated defense network meant to protect the galaxy. Something had gone wrong and the machines had turned against their creators. Before fleeing or dying, the precursors had left detailed warnings about what would trigger the Scourge to activate again. Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Price led the first group of human soldiers assigned to train with Council Defense Forces. Stephen was a career military officer with 20 years of combat experience, and he found the Council's approach to warfare almost laughable. The Corvani instructors taught tactics that had not changed in centuries, and they considered aggressive maneuvers to be uncivilized. When Stephen suggested flanking movements during a training exercise, he was politely told that such tactics were unnecessary in modern warfare. The Council had grown so used to peace that they had forgotten how to fight. Back on Earth, Dr. Nathan Wells headed a program to study and improve Council technology. His team made a surprising discovery, which was that Council technology was incredibly advanced in some areas, but stagnant in others. Nobody had made improvements to weapons or military systems in thousands of years. It was as if the entire galaxy had decided that warfare was a solved problem and not worth thinking about anymore. Nathan found this attitude troubling because history taught that civilizations that forgot how to defend themselves eventually fell to those who remembered. Ambassador Donovan attended her first full session of the Galactic Council, and the experience was educational. The session lasted 3 weeks and covered everything from trade disputes to environmental regulations. Every decision was made through consensus, which meant that dissenting voices were pressured to conform rather than outvoted. When Claire suggested more efficient procedures, she was met with polite dismissal. The Council's methods had worked for 12,000 years, so why change them now? On the frontier, observers reported more disappearances. Ships were vanishing without distress calls, and small colonies had gone silent. The Council dispatched investigation teams and filed reports, but nobody seemed concerned. Piracy was known to happen in remote areas, and the Council assumed this was just an uptick in criminal activity. The idea that something organized and hostile might be operating never occurred to them because the galaxy had been at peace for so long that war seemed impossible. Captain Lisa Hayes had been promoted to Commodore and given command of humanity's small military fleet. She reviewed the disappearance reports and recognized patterns that the Council was missing. Ships were vanishing in a specific sequence that suggested someone was testing response times and mapping defense capabilities. Lisa had seen similar patterns during her early career fighting insurgents in Earth's asteroid belt. This was not random piracy but organized reconnaissance. She brought her concerns to Ambassador Donovan, who promised to raise the issue with Council leadership. Corvin finally gave up on sending messages and decided to travel to Council Station in person. He used his life savings to book passage on a commercial transport and arrived at the station carrying all his research data. He requested an audience with the High Council and was told the waiting list was approximately 2 years long. Corvin tried to explain the urgency, but the administrative staff had heard urgent pleas from religious groups before. They were polite but firm. He would have to wait his turn like everyone else. The old seeker refused to accept this answer and began approaching individual ambassadors in public areas of the station. Most dismissed him as a fanatic, but a few listened politely before making excuses to leave. Corvin's behavior became increasingly desperate as he tried to make someone understand that the galaxy was running out of time. Station security eventually detained him for disturbing the peace, and after a few days they released him with a warning to stay away from the diplomatic levels. By pure chance, Corvan encountered Dr. Helen Garcia in one of the station's research libraries. Helen was searching for more precursor data to help with her work on Theta 7. Corvan recognized her as someone who might actually listen and carefully approached her. He explained about the temple activation and the countdown, and the technical nature of the precursor warnings. Helen was trained to consider all evidence regardless of where it came from, so she agreed to examine his data. What Helen saw in Korvan's research shocked her, because it matched what her team had been finding on Theta 7. The precursors had not been speaking in metaphors or religious language. They had left behind detailed technical documentation about an automated weapon system that had malfunctioned and destroyed their civilization. The texts clearly stated that specific conditions would reactivate the scourge, and those conditions were being met. Most disturbing was that the precursors had identified humans as essential to stopping the threat. They called humans the unoptimized ones because human evolution had been messy and chaotic rather than guided and controlled. Helen immediately contacted Ambassador Donovan and Commodore Hayes. The three women met with Korvan and reviewed all the evidence before requesting an urgent meeting with Velthar. The Korvani ambassador listened carefully and examined their data with genuine interest. Then he explained that this was a matter for the Historical and Cultural Committee to evaluate. It would take several years to properly assess whether these claims had merit. In the meantime, there was no need for alarm, because the Council had procedures for dealing with potential threats. Frustrated but determined, Helen returned to Theta 7 with new purpose. If the Council would not act, then humanity needed to understand the threat independently. She expanded her research team and brought in specialists from multiple fields. They worked around the clock to decode every piece of precursor information they could find. The more they learned, the more terrified they became because the scourge was not just powerful, but was designed specifically to counter advanced civilizations like the Council. Commodore Hayes quietly began preparing humanity's fleet for combat. She could not justify major military buildup through official channels because the Council had not declared any threat. However, Hayes trusted her instincts, and those instincts screamed that something bad was coming. She ordered combat drills and weapons upgrades using human military doctrine. Her crews trained for high-intensity combat, even though they were supposed to be learning Council peacekeeping procedures. Captain Ryan Foster was on approach to a frontier colony when his sensors detected a massive fleet emerging from faster-than-light travel. Ryan had military training from his younger days, and he recognized a combat formation when he saw one. He immediately altered course and activated every stealth system his cargo ship had. From his hiding spot behind a small moon, he watched in horror as 200 unknown vessels systematically destroyed the colony. There was no warning and no communication. The attacking ships simply appeared and began firing weapons that cut through defensive shields like they were not even there. Ryan managed to escape and pushed his ship's engines to their absolute limits, racing back toward Council space. He arrived at Council Station 3 days later with his crew traumatized and his ship barely functional. His report caused the first real alarm the Council had felt in centuries. An unknown hostile force had committed genocide against 3 million Plenari colonists. This was unprecedented and terrifying. The High Council convened an emergency. The Council's military response was organized with painful slowness. Fleet Admiral Kelthan of the Korvani Empire took command of 300 warships gathered from 12 different species. The fleet represented the largest military force assembled in 4,000 years, but it had been put together in just 2 weeks. The ships had no unified training, and their commanders had never worked together. They departed for the frontier to intercept the unknown hostile fleet while the Council watched and hoped. Commodore Lisa Hayes observed the Council fleet's departure from Council Station and felt cold dread settle in her chest. She had reviewed their tactical plans and found them predictable and cautious. The Council admirals were treating this like a police action against criminals who would surrender when faced with superior force. Hayes knew better because Korvan's translations made it clear the Scourge was an automated system, programmed for one purpose, which was eliminating biological life. You could not negotiate with a machine that had no other function. Ambassador Claire Donovan faced an impossible choice. The Council had formally requested that humanity refrain from military action because of their probationary status. But humanity had 6 warships ready for combat, and increasingly clear intelligence that the Council fleet was heading toward disaster. Claire made the hardest decision of her diplomatic career, and sent an encrypted message to Earth recommending that humanity prepare to act without Council approval if necessary. President Daniel Cole convened Earth Security Council, and the debate was intense. Some argued that humanity must respect Council authority and maintain their place in galactic society. Others, including Cole himself, believed humanity had a moral obligation to act if the Council fleet failed. The President authorized Commodore Hayes to shadow the Council fleet at a distance with orders to engage if the situation became desperate. Dr. Helen Garcia made a breakthrough on Theta 7. Deep in the precursor ruins, her team found what appeared to be a weapons development facility. The technology was far beyond anything humanity or the Council possessed, but the documentation was extensive. The precursors had been developing weapons specifically designed to fight the Scourge before they were forced to flee. Helen immediately contacted Commodore Hayes with coordinates and requested military support to excavate the site. Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Price took a team of combat engineers to Theta 7. What they discovered amazed them because the weapons manipulated space and time in ways that seemed impossible. There were missiles that could target ships traveling faster than light, and shields that drew power from alternate dimensions. The technology was functional but dormant and waiting for activation. The problem was that control. Systems were written in precursor code, and even with Helen's translations, full understanding would take months. The Council fleet made contact with the Scourge in a region called the Talon Nebula. Admiral Kelthan had chosen this location for its tactical advantages, because the dense stellar dust would limit enemy sensor range. The Council ships deployed in traditional Corvani formation, with vessels spread wide to maximize shield overlap. They broadcast demands for surrender and waited for response. The Scourge answered with devastating violence. Their weapons were designed by the precursors to penetrate any known defense, and they simply erased the Council ship's shields. The first volley destroyed 80 vessels in less than 30 seconds. The Council fleet, which had trained for ceremonies and police work, broke apart in confusion. Some ships tried to retreat, while others attempted counterattacks, and a few simply froze as their crews struggled to process what was happening. Admiral Kelthan showed courage by rallying about 100 ships for a fighting withdrawal. He managed to extract his survivors from the massacre, but the cost was terrible. 2/3 of the Council's military force had been destroyed in less than an hour. Kelthan's remaining ships fled back toward Council space, pursued by Scourge vessels that seemed content to herd them rather than finish them. Immediately, Commodore Hayes had positioned her 6 ships on the edge of the nebula, far enough to avoid detection but close enough to observe. Her tactical officers recorded everything, including weapon firing patterns and ship movements. Hayes noticed something the Council had missed, which was that the Scourge fought efficiently, but not optimally. Their tactics were good but rigid, because they followed programmed patterns without real-time adaptation. Hayes made a decision that would define her career. She ordered her ships to fall back toward Theta 7 at maximum speed. If the precursor weapons could be activated, humanity might have a chance, but they needed time. The only way to buy time was to slow the Scourge advance. Hayes sent a message to Earth stating that the Council fleet was destroyed and recommending immediate mobilization of all human military assets. President Cole authorized what would later be called the Sovereign Response. Every military vessel in human service, totaling 42 ships, was ordered to rendezvous at Theta 7. Additionally, Cole nationalized the civilian fleet and impressed 300 cargo and passenger vessels into service. These civilian ships had no weapons and minimal shields, but they had faster-than-light drives and human crews willing to help. Captain Ryan Foster volunteered to lead the civilian fleet even though his cargo ship Horizon was still being repaired. Hundreds of other merchant captains followed his example. They knew their vessels would not survive direct combat, but they could provide logistics and reconnaissance and, if necessary, act as decoys. Foster personally briefed each captain on what they faced, and every single one chose to stay. The Council descended into chaos. Surviving ships from Kelthan's fleet arrived at Council Station with reports of the massacre. Representatives faced military disaster for the first time in millennia and could not agree on responses. Some called for evacuation of core worlds, while others demanded construction of new fleets. A few, looking at astronomical casualty figures, began discussing surrender terms. Ambassador Donovan stood before the High Council and made a proposal that shocked the Assembly. Humanity, despite primitive technology and probationary status, was willing to take command of defending Council space. Human military forces would form the core of a new fleet supplemented by whatever Council vessels remained combat-ready. In exchange, humanity requested full access to precursor sites and complete tactical authority. The proposal met outrage from some representatives who could not accept that newcomers might lead their civilization. But Velthar surprised everyone by speaking in favor of humanity's offer. The old Corvani ambassador admitted what many refused to acknowledge, which was that long peace had made the Council weak. Humans with their violent history might see solutions that civilized thought missed. His support from a founding species turned the vote, and the Council granted humanity tactical command. Commodore Hayes suddenly found herself responsible for defending 400 worlds and trillions of lives. She had perhaps 2 weeks before the Scourge reached Council space. Her plan was audacious and desperate in equal parts. The civilian fleet would form a sensor network providing advance warning. Human military vessels would act as rapid response units using aggressive tactics to harass and delay. Meanwhile, every engineer would work to activate the precursor weapons. Dr. Garcia's team made progress through sheer desperation. They could not fully understand precursor systems, but they could activate them. Ancient weapons came online one by one, through jury-rigged connections to human control systems. The first successful test occurred 4 days before estimated Scourge arrival, and it was a weapon that projected localized fields of slowed time. Lieutenant Colonel Price proposed mounting precursor weapons on human vessels and firing them manually like oversized guns. Engineers thought he was insane because the power requirements could overload ship reactors. Price grinned and said emergency overrides existed for a reason. They would get 1, maybe 2 shots before ships exploded, but that would have to be enough. Council species contributed what they could. The Plenari provided expertise in shield harmonics, while the Gentari offered navigation knowledge. The Corvani sent their remaining 40 warships to serve under human command. Even minor civilizations with only handfuls of ships volunteered their crews. It was humanity's desperate plan, but it had become the galaxy's only hope. Ambassador Donovan worked on diplomatic fronts, coordinating evacuation plans and supply chains. She handled countless crises as entire civilizations prepared for war. When Velthar commented that she looked exhausted, Claire replied she would sleep when the galaxy was saved or dead, because either way the crisis would end. Scout ships reported the Scourge had entered Council space. They were not heading for population centers, but methodically destroying every installation in their path. It was systematic genocide carried out with mechanical efficiency. Hayes studied their approach and realized they were heading for Council Station. The Scourge intended to destroy the government before moving to populated worlds. Hayes divided her forces. The main fleet would defend Council Station, but she sent 20 ships, including 5 armed with precursor weapons, on a desperate offensive. Their target was the heart of the Scourge fleet, because precursor notes indicated a command ship coordinated the entire network. Kill that ship and the rest might go dormant. Captain Lisa Chang led her strike force of 20 ships deep into Scourge-controlled space, using routes mapped by civilian scouts. Her vessels moved through stellar dust and debris fields, playing a deadly game with Scourge patrols. 3 ships were detected and destroyed, but their sacrifice bought time for the others to reach their target. At the center of the Scourge fleet was a massive structure that matched precursor descriptions of a control nexus. At Council Station, Commodore Hayes prepared her main force for defense. She commanded 117 combat vessels, including 39 human ships and 40 Corvani warships, along with 38 vessels from other species. Against them came 300 Scourge warships, each more powerful than anything the Council had built. The mathematics were brutal, and Hayes knew they would lose unless something changed. Dr. Helen Garcia had spent every waking hour working on precursor weapons. Her team had activated 17 devices, but mounting them on ships proved difficult. The weapons were designed for installations or much larger vessels. In the end, they managed to arm 8 human destroyers and cruisers. Each armed ship was essentially a bomb because the power draw would burn out reactors within minutes. Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Price commanded ground defenses on Theta 7. If the Scourge bypassed the fleet, his 300 soldiers and makeshift defenses would be the last line protecting the research facility. Price had drilled his people hard on defensive positions throughout the ruins. He could not stop a ground assault, but might delay it long enough for evacuation. The battle began at dawn station time. The Scourge fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel in perfect geometric formation. They advanced on Council Station at steady pace, ignoring all communication attempts. Hayes held her fleet back, letting them approach because she had studied records obsessively. The Scourge opened combat at exactly 50,000 kilometers, and she needed them closer. Ambassador Claire Donovan watched from the station command center as the enemy approached. Council officials prepared for evacuation, but she refused to leave. Someone needed to coordinate with the fleet. Velthar also stayed, and the old Corvani stood beside her, saying, if this was the end, he would meet it in the council halls. At 40,000 kilometers, Hayes gave her first order. The civilian fleet scattered throughout the system lit up every sensor and beacon and transmitter. To Scourge detection systems, it appeared Council Station was defended by 500 ships. The enemy fleet hesitated and recalculated. Those few seconds let Hayes position her real combat ships more favorably. The Scourge reached engagement range and opened fire. Their weapons tore through space, but this time defenders were ready. Hayes had arranged ships in small dispersed groups rather than tight formations. The first volley destroyed only 12 vessels instead of 80. Human and Council ships returned fire-scoring hits that did minimal damage to superior Scourge armor. Captain James Kelly commanded the destroyer Defiant, which mounted a precursor weapon. He had strict orders to wait for Hayes' signal, then close to optimal range and fire everything. Kelly watched his tactical display as battle unfolded, waiting for his moment. Around him, his crew worked with practiced efficiency. The Scourge adapted to dispersed formations by breaking into hunter-killer groups pursuing individual vessels. Hayes rotated her forces, pulling damaged ships back while fresh units engaged. It was fluid, chaotic combat that human doctrine excelled at, but Council ships struggled. Corvani captains trained for set-piece battles found themselves overwhelmed. Captain Ryan Foster and the civilian fleet did what they could. Unarmed merchant ships could not fight, but they could be decoys and sensor platforms and rescue vessels. Foster led 20 ships racing into battle space, pulling survivors from destroyed vessels. His ship Horizon was hit by debris, but he kept flying, refusing to abandon anyone. Deep in Scourge space, Captain Chang's strike force reached the control nexus. The structure was enormous, measuring 10 kilometers across and covered in weapons. Chang had 5 ships with precursor weapons and 15 conventional vessels. The plan was simple, with conventional ships drawing defenses while equipped ships made attack runs. It was suicide tactics where success meant dying for purpose. Chang commanded the first attack wave. Her cruiser, Valiant, raced toward the Nexus at full speed with weapons firing continuously. Her crew knew they were not leaving alive. Chang felt strange calm as they closed to firing range. If the weapon worked, their deaths would save billions. At Council Station, Commodore Hayes watched her tactical display fill with red icons. She was losing ships faster than she could replace them. The Scourge numerical superiority was grinding her fleet down through attrition. She had bloodied them, destroying nearly 30 enemy vessels, but they were winning. It was time to use her trump cards. Hayes transmitted orders to all precursor armed vessels authorizing weapons free. Captain Kelly had maneuvered Defiant into perfect position and now had a clear shot at a large Scourge vessel. He ordered reactor to maximum and power to forward weapon. Warning alarms blared as systems failed, but Kelly focused on his target and gave the order to fire. The precursor weapon discharged and reality seemed to bend. A sphere of altered space-time projected from Defiant, striking the Scourge vessel. The enemy ship simply stopped, frozen in a bubble of slowed time. Seconds later, Defiant's reactor overloaded and Captain Kelly, with his crew of 42, died in fusion fire. 7 more times across the battlefield, the scene repeated. Human ships burned themselves out to activate precursor weapons. Each time a Scourge vessel was neutralized through being frozen or torn apart or deleted from existence. 8 Scourge ships eliminated at the cost of 8 human vessels and 360 human lives. At the Nexus, Captain Chang fired her weapon at point-blank range. The device, designed to disrupt advanced artificial intelligence, released a pulse washing over the control sphere. For a moment nothing happened, then the Nexus went dark. Across the galaxy, Scourge vessels paused as connection to Central Command severed. Some went dormant immediately, while others continued fighting on automated subroutines without coordination. Chang did not live to see success. Backlash from the weapon overloaded Valiant systems and the ship broke apart. Her last transmission, picked up by surviving Strike Force vessels, was simple, stating, "Tell Hayes it worked." At Council Station, Hayes watched the Scourge fleet falter. They were still dangerous and fighting but had lost coordination. What had been an unstoppable wave was now individual ships following last orders without adaptation. She immediately pressed advantage, ordering her fleet to focus fire on confused enemy vessels. The battle raged 4 more hours. Without the Nexus coordinating them, Scourge ships proved less formidable. They were deadly, but could be outmaneuvered and tricked and destroyed by concentrated fire. By the time the last Scourge vessel was eliminated, Hayes had only 32 ships remaining. The cost had been staggering, with 4,000 Council personnel and 718 humans dead. But they had won. Against impossible odds, using weapons barely understood and led by a species new to galactic community, they had defeated the Scourge. Council Station's emergency teams worked around the clock, rescuing survivors and providing medical care. The scale of destruction was mind-numbing, with over 40 million Council citizens dead during the incursion. Commodore Hayes barely had time to grieve. Every surviving Scourge ship needed accounting and destruction. Dr. Garcia's team worked to secure the control nexus, ensuring it could not reactivate. Someone needed to make sure the galaxy would be ready if the Scourge or something like it ever returned. On Theta 7, Lieutenant Colonel Price and his team had watched battle through real-time feeds. When the Scourge fleet went silent, Price's soldiers erupted in cheers. They had been ready to die defending the facility, but now had a chance to live. Price immediately ordered his people to secure every piece of precursor technology, because the weapons that saved the Council needed understanding. Captain Ryan Foster and surviving civilian captains returned to Council Station as heroes. Their unarmed vessels had saved hundreds of lives through rescue operations and provided critical intelligence. Foster found himself uncomfortable with attention, saying he just did what needed doing, same as thousands of others. The High Council convened 1 week after battle. The chamber was subdued, with representatives still processing near extinction. Ambassador Donovan stood before them, exhausted but determined, beside Commodore Hayes and Dr. Garcia. Velthar, speaking for the Council, made a short statement revoking humanity's probationary status. Earth and all human worlds were granted full Council membership with complete rights and privileges. The Council went further than just granting membership. In a vote that would reshape galactic politics for centuries, they created a new position called Supreme Military Commander of Council Forces. The position would have authority over all military matters, answerable only to the High Council itself. They offered the position to Commodore Hayes because after 4,000 years of peace, the galaxy needed someone who understood war. Hayes accepted, but only with conditions. She insisted on complete authority to restructure Council military forces and access to all precursor sites for research, and permission to establish an academy that would train officers from all species in modern combat doctrine. The Council agreed without hesitation because the era of comfortable complacency was over. President Daniel Cole addressed Earth from the White House, broadcasting to a planet that had spent weeks wondering if their small fleet would survive. Cole spoke of sacrifice and courage and humanity's place among the stars. 718 names were read aloud, representing every human who died in battle. Each would be remembered, Cole promised, as the generation that saved not just humanity, but all sentient life in the galaxy. Dr. Helen Garcia returned to Theta 7 with a team 3 times her original size. The Council had opened archives fully, and what she found amazed her. The precursors had not just left warnings about the Scourge, but an entire legacy of knowledge carefully hidden and coded. It would take decades, maybe centuries, to uncover all their secrets. One discovery stood out, which was why precursors specifically mentioned humans in Prophecies. The ancient texts made it clear that precursors had been too advanced and too optimized and too predictable. Their own creations could anticipate every move. Humans, still carrying genetic legacy of millions of years of chaotic evolution, were unpredictable in ways precursors could never be. That chaos and human tendency to break rules had been exactly what was needed. Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Price was promoted to general and given command of the new Council Defense Academy on Earth. Students from 100 species arrived to study human military doctrine. Price found himself teaching young Corvani and Plenary officers about tactical flexibility and asymmetric warfare. The Council species had much to teach humanity about technology and civilization, but humanity had lessons to share about survival. Captain James Kelly and other human captains who died activating precursor weapons were posthumously awarded the Council's highest honor called the Star of Unity. Their families received medals and ceremonies broadcast across council space. Kelly's widow stood before millions and spoke simply, saying her husband did what needed doing, and all of them did the same. She asked that they be remembered not as victims but as people who chose to stand when the galaxy needed them. Corvan, the old seeker whose warnings had been ignored, suddenly found himself in demand. The council wanted to know everything he had learned about precursors. Research institutions offered positions and universities requested lectures. Corvan accepted some offers and declined others, choosing to work with Dr. Garcia's team on Theta 7. The human scientist, he said, had been the only one to listen when listening mattered. 6 months after battle, a memorial was unveiled on Council Station. It stood in the main concourse as a crystalline sculpture listing names of every being who died in the Scourge War. 40 million Council citizens and 718 humans were remembered. At dedication, Velthar stood beside Ambassador Donovan and spoke of how the Council had grown complacent in peace and how humanity reminded them that survival required vigilance. The galactic economy slowly recovered. Trade routes reopened and colonies were rebuilt, and life returned to something approaching normal. But it was a different galaxy now because Council species had been shaken from comfortable assumptions. They had seen that peace was not inevitable, and civilization could fall, and survival sometimes required the violence they tried to evolve beyond. Humanity's role in the Council expanded rapidly. Human military advisors were attached to every major defense force. Human engineers worked on upgrading planetary defenses. Human diplomats schooled in Earth's complex history helped mediate disputes. The Council still moved slowly on many issues, but when it came to security, they learned to listen to humans. Supreme Commander Hayes built the military force the Council needed. She could not make Council species as aggressive as humans and honestly did not want to, but she could make them prepared. Fleets were restructured along flexible lines and new weapons were developed incorporating precursor technology with modern safety protocols. Most importantly, she established a culture where military readiness was not warmongering, but responsible stewardship of peace. Dr. Garcia made breakthrough after breakthrough in precursor ruins. Each discovery was carefully shared with the Council, advancing galactic technology by leaps. But Garcia also enforced strict protocols because some technologies like weapons the Scourge used were too dangerous. Those secrets were documented and encrypted and locked away against future need. The galaxy had nearly destroyed itself with automated weapons. Once, and Garcia would not enable a repeat. President Cole served out his term and was succeeded by President Jennifer Lawson, who had been Earth's ambassador to the Corvani. Lawson continued policies of deep engagement with Council affairs. Earth was no longer a provincial world on the periphery, but a major power, and humanity needed to wield that power responsibly. Civilian heroes like Captain Ryan Foster returned to normal lives, but found those lives changed. Foster could not just be a merchant captain anymore because he had seen too much and done too much. He eventually accepted a position with the new Merchant Marine Academy, training civilian captains in crisis response. If another disaster came, the civilian fleet would be ready. On the first anniversary of battle, memorial services were held across Council space. On Earth, President Lawson unveiled a monument to the 718. Names were inscribed in stone at Earth Defense Headquarters, where every officer would see them daily. Lawson spoke about sacrifice and duty and the price of peace. Then she introduced Supreme Commander Hayes. Hayes stood before crowds, looking older than her 52 years. Command had aged her, but her eyes remained sharp and determined. She spoke not of victory or glory, but of responsibility. "We won," she said, "but winning once is not enough. The galaxy needs us to stay vigilant and stay ready and stay human. We can never forget what the Council learned at such terrible cost. Peace is not the absence of conflict, but the willingness to prepare for conflict while working every day to prevent it." In the decade that followed, the Council transformed. New technologies based on careful precursor knowledge improved life across the galaxy. Military forces, while never neglected, remained tools for defense rather than conquest. Humanity's influence grew, but so did human integration. As millions of humans lived on Council worlds and alien species, established communities on Earth. The Scourge had been defeated, but remnants remained scattered across the galaxy. Hunt teams, always including human advisors, tracked down and neutralized dormant Scourge vessels. Each find provided more data and more understanding. Dr. Garcia's team eventually concluded the scourge had been fully eradicated, but the galaxy kept forces ready just in case. Commander Jake Morrison, who led humanity's first contact mission, retired from service and wrote memoirs. He reflected on how much had changed since Endeavour crossed into Council space. Humanity had gone from hopeful newcomers to saviors of civilization. But Morrison warned against pride because humanity's chaos and unpredictability were strengths but could also be weaknesses. The galaxy needed human innovation but also needed Council wisdom. Ambassador Claire Donovan eventually returned to Earth exhausted after a decade of diplomatic service. She took a position teaching at the new Interspecies Relations Institute, sharing experiences with students from across the galaxy. She often told classes that the most important lesson was simple. Diversity was not just pleasant ideal but survival. The Council nearly died because they all thought alike. Humanity saved them precisely because humans thought differently. Velthar, now ancient even by Corvani standards, lived to see the 20th anniversary of battle. He spent final years writing comprehensive history of the Scourge War, ensuring future generations would remember how close the galaxy came to extinction. His final entry, written days before death, was brief. "We ignored warnings until almost too late. We dismissed humans as primitives. We nearly paid for both mistakes with existence. Let no future council make the same errors." The precursor prophecy had been fulfilled, but not as anyone expected. They had not predicted humans would save the galaxy through special weapons or techniques. They simply recognized the galaxy needed chaos and unpredictability, and a species that did not think like everyone else. In humanity's messy, chaotic, violent history lay seeds of innovation that comfortable, peaceful galaxy had lost. Supreme Commander Hayes, on the 30th anniversary, stood in the memorial chamber where war had been fought. She was 74 now and considering retirement. Around her, the newest generation of officers from Human and Corvani and Plenari and dozen other species attended ceremonies remembering the fallen.
Hayes looked at young faces and saw hope. The ancient prophecies spoke of humans, Hayes told them.
They said we would bring chai,